Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. I'm Andy Williams.
I'm Emily Horgan and Joe Redfern. Who do we have here today?
Well, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast a friend of the podcast and someone that we all are fans of in terms of his writing, Ian Whittaker, who's a media analyst and founder of Liberty Sky Advisors. And before we start, I'm going to say something that I always think about when I think about Ian Whittaker, and that's the caveat that you put on all of your LinkedIn posts, that the content of this podcast today does not constitute investment advice.
Thank you for that. I don't want anyone losing money.
Yeah, that's the title of the episode.
Yeah.
But listen, I mean, we're delighted that you're here because you and I have had we've had debates in the past. So we'll kick off with the subject of that debate and we can take it from there because I know we've got lots of provocations and things to discuss. Yeah. But YouTube is TV. It's a debate that rears its head on a daily basis. And you've said before that it's kind of about money. Mm-hmm. I think about, it's really about what is TV anyway? How do we even define TV these days? But when you say it's about money, what do you mean by that?
Well, I come from the financial market. So having looked at companies over the years, what you tend to realize is that pretty much all their decision making ultimately boils down to what will make them the most money and what will help in terms of shareholder value. And that's particularly the case with US companies where there's actually a legal requirement. So what I mean by this is if you look at sort of what's happening with YouTube at the moment, YouTube, when you take it, it's an advertising behemoth. Sort of globally, it's got around 35.7 billion of dollars in revenues in 2024. But the simple fact is, if you actually look at its growth rate, it's not that much. In the advertising side of things, it's not that much above the growth rate for Google's search business. Now, nobody would claim that Google's search business is a very good business, it dominates the market and so forth, but nobody would claim that it is a market that is set to see massive growth over the next 5 to 6 years. And the YouTube growth rate hasn't really sort of the difference between sort of the search growth rate and the YouTube growth rate, in advertising at least, hasn't really sort of fluctuated that much over the past sort of 2 years, 3 years. And so my view is simply this, that I think a lot of the reason why we're seeing this YouTube is TV debate coming down is if you actually go back to the end of last year, Google had been saying about YouTube, look, we're focusing very much on the subscription side of things to drive its revenue growth, and that is a very profitable business. At the end of last year, the growth, though, in the subscription revenues in the fourth quarter slowed down. And I think that sort of in many ways preempted a push into the argument that YouTube is TV. Because if you look at the pot of money that is out there in terms of TV, 2024 is around $170 billion of TV advertising revenues out there. So go back to that figure we had before with YouTube, 35.7 billion. If YouTube wants to accelerate its growth rate in terms of advertising revenues, the obvious pot of money to go after is the TV advertising money. How do you do that? The first step that you actually do is actually go to particularly the media buyers and the agencies and advertisers in general that you should be considered part of the TV pot of money.
Yeah.
And therefore, when it comes to negotiations, that when advertisers are thinking about how much money they need to put on TV, what they start to think about is that YouTube is an alternative. So my view on this is it's not, so there is a view that essentially TV has suddenly become democratized, that everyone's watching content creators, that suddenly there's a plethora of producers out there. We don't know what YouTube's audience split is. But if you take the latest figures from the US in terms of Nielsen numbers, around 13.1% audience share for August 2024. And I know, Joe, we've had a bit of a debate on sort of what constitutes that. My view of that is that content creators probably make up around 5% or less of that figure. There's probably a very large chunk of it that is essentially his music videos off the back of Vivo. And again, in the past, there's been talk around 25% of all YouTube viewing coming off music. Some of it will also as well be broadcasters' own content, but there's likely to be, I would say, not a huge amount left over for content creators.
But I think in terms of how audiences perceive things, still that very much there seems to be a preference there for long-form content with how things are. And if you look at what television is, then television still primarily is a long form content game. We could talk about what TV is, sort of how things are changing, given that the delineations between streaming and linear are still very much sort of blurring. But if you were to take what is probably the most realistic view of how much of US TV viewing, and the US will be ahead of the curve in terms of where the rest of the world is, you're still probably looking at over 90% of US TV viewing is still premium long form content in one form or another. That is not a market that is rapidly switching over to content creators, certainly not on the trends that are going at the moment. And if you were to extrapolate, even if you were to assume that, for example, all of YouTube's viewing is content creation and so forth, around 13%, you look at its trend rate, you're probably looking, in order to get to, let's say 30% of the market, you're probably looking another 7-8 years coming through that. So this is not, there is a feeling, I think, out there that suddenly content creators are everywhere, that suddenly the population has switched. My own view is that this is a classic case as well of the media industry really running ahead of the general population. That the general population does tend to have, let's say, slower uptake of habits than perhaps people who work in, certainly in our industry do. And what's happening is that's probably a disproportionate amount of people in the media industry think, wow, so much that we watch these days is content creation. You were to go out there to the general population, they are still very much watching TV in a traditional way.
So is it what you're saying is content creators are not TV?
I think that, that's a very good question, actually. I think they can be. No, because if you think about it this way, what's almost as word the core competency of television? The way I would describe it is that essentially it produces visual content that is generally of high quality and distributes that to a mass market audience. There's absolutely no reason why a certain subset of content creators cannot be included in that definition. And my view would be, look, and I've said this to the broadcasters themselves, what the broadcasters should do is actually they should co-opt the content creators themselves.
100%. And it's beginning to start just slowly. I think there's an inherent snobbishness from a lot of broadcasters about bringing creators on board, but they're beginning to warm up a little bit.
Well, I think there's a mixture of things. I mean, I think, probably, you could say an element of snobbishness, definitely conservatism, full stop, a view that the industry is only really about formats in a certain way. I think also as well, you've got to remember safety. People tend to be naturally risk averse. Broadcasters have, and this is again sort of one of the points about the debate around YouTube is TV, is that broadcasters are governed by a set of regulations for the licenses that they hold. YouTube doesn't have that. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the whole YouTube is TV debate and the debate that's come out of, from what YouTube has said, is that they are very keen to take the sort of TV side when it comes to advertising money, but when it comes to the regulation side, suddenly they're not really TV. Suddenly it's technology and you're stifling innovation and, you can't have regulation because that's not really the way it works. Now,
but aren't those two things? I'm going to play devil's advocate on that a bit because I think I think there is a strong case to say treating it like a TV station would be a challenge to the stuff that people think of as innovation within YouTube. And I think part of the way we're talking about it is that I think there is a distinction between shareholder value and value to the viewer. And I also think that something like, so we're tending to kind of talk about content creators or user-generated content as not TV and then everything else as TV. But you couldn't get those content creators and that user-generated content in the same way if YouTube was treated like a TV channel with the responsibility over that content that a TV channel would take. You just couldn't have that user-generated component to YouTube. So treating it like a TV station would fundamentally mean you'd have to remake what YouTube was really. I get their argument that they are different from TV stations and don't operate in the same way, because I do think they're they kind of cross over, but they exist in very different categories.
I mean, I would say that it's, and I totally understand that sort of argument, and yeah, it obviously has advantages for YouTube in terms of thinking that way, which naturally, they should think about the benefit to them. I guess I would step back and think about what exactly is the point of regulation. And are we saying that essentially regulation is one of those things that is a modern era, isn't really sort of as importance as it was in the past? Or do we say that essentially it is still the same level of importance? Now, you can take a view.
Well, there is one, because I also think the other myth slightly is that YouTube just isn't regulated. It is regulated. It's just not regulated in the same way that TV is regulated, because they're treated differently.
Well, treated differently, but I mean, it's in terms of, I think if you look at the content on YouTube, it's fair to say that there is much more license given to the type of content than you could certainly put on a broadcaster's. I think just as a slight tangent, I think this question is going to become increasingly more important, because the thing that essentially sort of limited the broadcasters in the past was you had a fixed amount of quantity in terms of the linear TV network. Yep. Where you could show content. That's not the case with their streaming services. So as more of their sort of viewing goes online, that sort of capacity to show that content, which is really the main barrier to entry, somewhat disappears. I mean, my view is that essentially we should have a level playing field one way or the other. I go back to this point about regulation, sort of what is the purpose of regulation? If you take that point of view that it doesn't really suit YouTube, then effectively what you're saying is that regulations should suit the business models of the companies that work in their sector. Now, that would be very much of a free market idea in terms of that. Margaret Thatcher would probably be very much in sort of approval of that. But
could you not argue that we regulate different industry, or we regulate different things in different ways, that there isn't just a blanket regulatory approach, that we recognize that this is slightly different from this, and so we'll regulate it differently?
I mean, that's one argument, but it all boils down to
bricks and mortar shops get regulated differently from digital services.
Yeah. I mean, they have to pay rent and so forth, which is why you've seen so many SMEs actually move online. And high street is deserted. Now, most people would say the outcome of a deserted high street is not exactly the optimal outcome for many towns. But that is a feature of what's happened with the regulation. I think, again, it comes back to this point that if you're looking in terms of YouTube being, claiming it's TV, what you need is a level playing field. As I said before, what's happening with YouTube is it's trying to claim both sides of the coin. It's trying to say when it comes to the advertising money, and as it were, piggybacking off the idea that TV is brand safe, that essentially it's got regulation behind it, that it's got trusted audiences. Look, we're TV, so therefore give us your advertising money. The moment that you then get sort of talk about, well, actually this comes with responsibilities as well, because like with anything in life, arguably, you have rights, you also have responsibilities as well. And when it comes to the responsibility side of things, suddenly the whole YouTube is TV debate suddenly starts to take a different direction. And then it talks about, as you were saying, we can't really do that. It wouldn't help with content creators and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is what it is creating, is an unlevel playing field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again,
I completely recognize that.
About content creators should be embracing TV. One of the reasons why actually they're stopped from doing so is because of the regulations around TV. So if you do want content creators to actually be more on TV, that would suggest that actually what you've got to do is you've got to loosen the regulations around TV. So, at the moment, the regulatory model is very, very much weighted in favor of YouTube.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I feel like YouTube walk this paradoxical line in many areas. They definitely walk it on the kid side too, where YouTube is not for kids, and yet, YouTube Kids turned 10 and there was a big, hoo-ha, and we know that plenty of content on, like, I would say a massive portion of YouTube content is targeted at kids. We know this. So, yeah, it walks that paradoxical line in many ways. But I would also say, like, thinking back to your point about like the change of audiences and media practitioners, media professionals, media analysts, commentators being ahead of the change of the general population, I would say, thinking about our audience, kids also tend to be ahead of the general population. And so their use of YouTube has become so utterly ubiquitous that it's, for a kid's brand of any type, creator, traditional IP, it's be on YouTube or be irrelevant is kind of the options that you have. And I think we have seen, and that's why I made that point to begin with of like, if you're speaking about creator level content, I get the point there. But for us in kids, yes, there's a huge amount of kids creators on YouTube, but equally, all of the traditional brands, all the main traditional brands are also there too, and they have to be in that traditional long form type approach, whether it's full episodes or not. It's still, there's still like long form type episodes, compilations, etc. that are being pushed out, to an audience there. So that's why I would say, YouTube is TV for the kids audience, very much so, that they go there for all types of content, not just creator-led content.
And I think, that in itself raises a number of different issues. And you're right. I mean, like, you look at kids viewing of YouTube is extremely high. I mean, one is that my view is that the general broadcasters are missing a big trick here. Yeah, and this is one of the sort of other longer term trends that I think is going to influence what happens in the advertising space and the media space generally, is that if you look at one of the interesting things about the whole is YouTube TV's way and talking about its audience share, is that what it's leading to is what I would call sort of an equalization of audience or an equalization of time. And what I mean by that is that essentially people are not necessarily looking at the quality of what people are watching or what they're watching on the platforms. They're just looking at the total aggregate amount. Now, from my view, where I think the broadcasters, this argument about they're losing audience share, therefore they're losing advertising. One area that I think they should focus on more is actually children's content.
Say that again, Ian. Can you once more? Say that again, please.
Broadcasters should focus on children's content. And really, there are two drivers of that, why that rationally that makes a lot of sense. Actually, you could argue there's three. One is, as you say, it drives audience share amongst kids. And if you go back to the point that I just said, that increasingly the way that people are looking at things is they're not dissecting exactly the quality or what people are watching, because there's so many channels that are just aggregating everything into one bucket. The point being with that, if you want one-liner, is people are just looking at the aggregate total now, rather than essentially sort of splitting it out and saying it's percentage form or whatever. So, if broadcasters can get heavily into children's content, then by its very nature, what they're likely to see is an uptick in their overall audience share, particularly when it comes to younger audiences. The second thing is essentially in terms of this whole thing of, and we can come back to this point in a moment, viewing habits. Yeah, if you catch children young, is it something that essentially sort of goes on into later life? Again, if the broadcasters can capture that, then that should be a positive, and it's a positive either way. If they children do continue with those trends, great. They've been established watching sort of traditional broadcasters. If they don't, quite frankly, the broadcasters haven't really lost anything over the long term. I think the third point also as well, would just say sort of on that is that, again, I think it also as well helps from a regulatory environment as well. And I think the broadcasters would be sort of reinforcing their position in terms of brand safety. And I think generally it would probably be good for children's content anyway.
Yeah.
If you had these established players been more recognized in the market. So no, absolutely. I mean, my view is there are two areas where broadcasters are missing a big trick. And it's increasingly because of this whole thing around where the debate is going in terms of audiences. One is in terms of children's content, because of the potential there to add a large bunch of audience. The other thing, which may seem quite strange, but also as well, I think it would make a difference in terms of audience share. And again, it comes back to this point about the percentage of YouTube's viewing that it is music videos. These are those two categories, music and children's video, and that you could argue is the fourth point, they're actually relatively cheap ways to build up your audience, and therefore buttress the argument that because you've got this amount of audience share, you should maintain your share of advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think particularly with kids, there's an element where the argument that YouTube is TV is because in some respects, YouTube has swallowed up kids' TV. Mm-hmm. That even kids' TV that exists on channels finds a home on YouTube. But the dilemma with it, particularly for people that work in the kids media industry, is that the monetization, particularly for kids on YouTube, is very difficult. And I think one of the reasons from that, we had Gregory Dre on the podcast a while back from Animarch, and he was explaining how for kids it has to be contextual advertising. That it's not their advertising on YouTube isn't sold in the same way that all of the advertising for the rest of YouTube is sold, and that it's not big enough for YouTube to create a bespoke advertising setup just for kids. But I wondered if we're talking about more established media players and traditional TV, whether you thought there was any opportunity for them to have a role in selling the advertising within that, for YouTube within that kids sector.
I mean, they could, but again, I'd sort of touch on this, that by its very nature is suggesting that the broadcasters play almost like a secondary role. That actually the sort of what they're used for is the sales houses more than anything else. Now, sort of, there were three things here that I could say on this. The first thing I think is that when it comes to broadcasters, and this again is one for general debate, why can't broadcasters be a bit more ambitious and actually say, look, we will try to become almost like a YouTube for our countries. This is what TF1 in France is talking about, becoming the YouTube of France. Now, you may argue that that's actually a very, very ambitious target. But if you look at a lot of the content that is shown, going back to that description before about broadcasters, television companies, really their core competency, broadcasting audiovisual content to a mass market audience, there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. I think the second thing is it's an issue that I think is easily rectified. You're absolutely right that if you look at why YouTube actually hoovered up children's content, it was because the broadcasters stepped back. And nature abhors a vacuum. So when there is a vacuum, somebody is going to step into it. And YouTube is actually the most obvious sort of platform to do that. The third thing that essentially, again, I don't think why this is necessarily a good strategy for the broadcasters, it is to come back to that point before. The whole argument now that, and it's why I also disagree with the broadcasters putting their content on YouTube. What I think they should be doing is really driving audiences to their own streaming platforms. If we're going into a world where what's happening is people are saying your share of advertising should equate to your share of audience, and nobody is actually looking at the share of audience, what actually makes up that share of audience on a platform, then broadcasters in a way are providing the bullets for the gun that is going to be used to kill them. Because it is their content that is helping to boost up YouTube's audience share, which then goes off and says we should have more share of TV advertising. Yeah. And of course, if it's your content, why should you look to only get 60% of it when you can get 100%?
Does this lend credence to the argument that Project Kangaroo should be resurrected? Remember the combining streamers in the UK were a relatively small territory. It starts to make some sense now, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, I would say from a strategic standpoint, that's absolutely true. The problem will be that the problem with all these things is not necessarily the concept. The concept makes a lot of sense. The problem is actually the people involved and actually clashing their heads together. And again, this is one of the things that would say that, certainly the tech companies have an advantage of. The decision-making process is usually quite quick and quite lean. When you try to get something, between the broadcasters, it becomes that classic sort of compromise situation. Somebody doesn't want to do something. I mean, as I say, my personal view is the biggest sort of biggest plus for the broadcasters at the moment, if they really wanted to get things going and would add a lot of value, is essentially have somebody in the room who effectively is a really good negotiator, bringing them all together and does it in a very quick format. Because that's really the problem here. Kangaroo makes a lot of strategic sense. Absolutely you want one platform that can leverage off its strengths. The problem will be, in practice, what will happen is you will get the decision-making process will take away many of its good features.
I just wanted to dig into the kind of the unit economics, because this is something that comes up in kids media and YouTube all the time. Because obviously creator revenue streams, if you're talking about the big channels, they can be meaningful, but it is a different unit economics. And we're talking predominantly about ads, but have you ever really looked at things like subscriptions and memberships? We spoke about it's a very different consumption environment, YouTube. And when I look at, you're not going to make the same kind of revenues as you would have done on your media rights, but I do wonder if YouTube is not really, because it makes 35 billion, as you mentioned in ad res, not really utilizing the other tools that it has, that it makes available to creators or broadcasters on there in terms of those subscriptions and memberships and exclusives and super chats and things like that. Have you looked at that in terms of the unit economics that that could be those replacements for broadcaster CPMs?
Well, I think if you look at YouTube does have a substantial subscription business. It doesn't disclose the numbers, but you're probably looking well north of $20 billion per annum in terms of that. So, and, that will be for things such as music channels. It was also as well in terms of it's sort of YouTube TV in the States, and people watching NFL games and so forth. So it definitely has monetized the subscription model. If you look at the comments from the last results conference call, and what Google's management was saying, they were talking about, what was interesting when they were talking about YouTube was the focus was very much going on they said, look, it will be the subscription side of the business that will be the primary driver of growth. They're not saying that they won't rely on advertising, but they seem to be pivoting to saying that subscription is probably going to be the fastest growing side of the business. So I think from an overall unit standpoint, I think YouTube is very much going down that road of subscription growth. I think when it comes to can content creators necessarily monetize subscriptions and so forth, and they can do it in place of advertising, I mean, theoretically, yes, in terms of that. I mean, you've got to have, the problem is with the content game, it's a bit like there's so much content out there. I mean, the parallel I would use in terms of content creators, I mean, I put it on LinkedIn sort of a couple of weeks back, is that content creators are the food delivery drivers, of the content world. I mean, the barriers to entry are low and are getting lower. There's a huge amount of them out there, and they don't really have that much rights on things. So I think
barriers to entry are low, he says, to the people who put the podcast on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. I know.
We know a bit about it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot that, I mean, talk. But what I mean by that is that literally there is not the same license requirements. I mean, you could just, theoretically, you could just set up your channel if you've got the time and inclination to do so. So any sort of market where you get that, the power is always going to be weighted in favor of the distributor.
Yeah. Very much similar to the gig economy, isn't it? You've just got to keep going more and more.
Absolutely. I'm a historian, and I mean, I put food delivery, but actually the thing that always sort of springs to my mind, I think the sort of content creators, is the sort of pre-World War I dock labour schemes where literally labourers would turn up every day and the sort of the factory workers or the dock managers would actually just pick out and the rest had to go home without any guarantee of income. And in a way, that's very much where things are. But again, subscriptions, sponsorships, etc., they're driven by the same factors as advertising revenues. It's popularity. It's whether people will actually sort of listen to you. And okay, you could argue if you're a niche and a high quality niche that subscriptions make more sense than advertising because you haven't necessarily got the volume numbers. It's all really driven by the same factors. But the short answer is, do I think those revenues for a content creator can actually place advertising revenues? I think in most cases, the answer will be no.
You see, the thing for me, when I think of the YouTube versus TV debate, is that in a way, it's like, well, TV is an industry, YouTube is a company. But when I consider YouTube an industry, right? Like YouTube is an industry that the monetization for a YouTube-led business is not just YouTube, particularly if you work in kids, because YouTube revenue is down for kids, up to 70% since the FTC ruling of 2019. So it's a slice of the pie, but like it's definitely not going to feed the family. And so I think of like YouTube is there then to build your brand, support consumer products, support recommissioning of your shows, to demonstrate fandom. Ideally, if you're a content creator, you're reselling, your YouTube content through to other platforms as well. That's bringing in revenue. We look at Miss Rachel on Netflix. Ian, look at her. Have you seen Miss Rachel on Netflix?
You know what? It's not exactly my top thing, but I have passed a whole load of posters.
Yes. But like Miss Rachel, major content creator on YouTube, jumped onto Netflix concurrently, non-exclusive deal, as in she's still on YouTube and she's on Netflix, and has come in with phenomenal numbers, in her first half of the year. And, I really would hope that, is making a good amount of money from that Netflix deal. I think that's honestly, not to digress too much, but I think for the top creators, I think doing exclusive deals with platforms that are highly lucrative is the way they should go, because Miss Rachel is bringing a massive audience to Netflix. Her content is high quality, it's educational, it's high quality. Parents feel safe watching, parents feel safe leaving their kids in front of it, and they feel actually safer leaving their kids in front of that content when it's on Netflix versus when it's on YouTube. So I don't know, what I'm saying is that, obviously when we look at YouTube, and you're right, when you boil it down to the advertising revenue and the growth as a company, it's not replaced TV, but TV is an industry, not a company, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I get that. And it's, again, it sort of goes back to what we were saying before. I mean, YouTube can be a great springboard to go into other areas. I mean, you look at Mr. Beast. I mean, what did Mr. Beast do? He then went on Amazon and did a show. I mean, I would argue for many content creators, almost what the ultimate goal would be is to get on TV. TV still has very much of this cachet.
Oh, yeah.
But, YouTube in a way sort of doesn't have. And this is why I think, again, the TV companies are missing out on a big opportunity here. Netflix has been quicker to do it. Amazon has been quicker to do it. The traditional broadcasters, I would argue, are still very much in a conservative element.
Yeah, I'd agree.
The other thing is, if that's what would say is the positive side, I guess if you want to sort of talk about, though, is more the negative side, is I think there is a reason why when we look at sort of content creators on YouTube, the same names crop up time and time again. Yeah,
there's definitely a winner takes all aspect.
Yeah, it's Mr. Beast, it's Miss Rachel. There's a couple of others that are out there, but literally every conversation that goes on, every conversation about who's launching chocolate bars or who's got brand sponsorship or who's got, there's certain names. Now, in niches, you've obviously as well, you've got people who are doing well in a particular niche, whether that be history or whatever. But as you're absolutely right, Andy, this is very much a winner takes all market. And again, it almost becomes like a fight to the death sort of situation where you've got so many content creators who want to make money. But at the end of the day, there's only 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
Also, as well, when it comes to things like monetization, people have only got a certain amount of money in their wallet. And there's going to be a gravitational pull there where it's going to come to the biggest names. I think also as well, this is slightly tangential, but I think it is of interest. I think Evan Shapiro posted up sort of a list of the top 50 channels. What was interesting on there was 15 were I think sort of off memory, 15 of them were Indian.
Yes.
And
15 of them were what?
Indian.
15 of them were Indian.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing there, of course, is that India's had a ban on TikTok. It's a geopolitical situation.
And also have very, very cheap Wi-Fi data, and phone penetration is huge.
Yeah.
Do you think, I sometimes think the problem with YouTube, and maybe with a lot of the social video platforms, is it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about shareholder value. I think if you kind of almost view content creators as in some ways shareholders in YouTube as well, because they're adding their own value to the channel. is for the shareholders. They don't necessarily receive the value they think they're going to get from YouTube. Whereas if you look at the attention or the awareness that's generated from YouTube, it's kind of off the charts. So you have that tension of needing to be there so people know you exist, because otherwise you just vanish into obscurity. But there's no real way to successfully monetize it. And I feel that extends beyond kids into kind of the content creators generally on YouTube, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, like it's the power is all weighted. If you think about this as like a sort of non-unionized workforce, right? And this is why I made the point before about it. Sort of historically, it goes back to the days when you'd get people just turning up. Yeah, every person who used to turn up looking for work at at the dock was an individual. They never formed together. You know, they had that very much of their own interests that they wanted to look after. So that very much meant that the sort of power was very much in the hand of the dock owners. And it's a similar sort of thing when we look at the situation here with YouTube. There is no unionized sort of content creators. There's no boycott of YouTube for their low commission rates. Pretty much everyone is sort of out for their own interests, as indeed, you know, it makes perfect sense. But any situation that you have like that, the bargaining power will always remain on the side of the person who is effectively choosing. The only way that tends to change, and this again is where, you know, maybe broadcasters can play a role, is if another entity comes in and suddenly offers a much better deal. And can also offer the promise as well, as going back to that point, can also offer the promise as well and saying, look, we can give you the exposure that you need. But where things stand at the moment, quite frankly, if you're YouTube and you're looking at a business model and you think about your operating profits, why would you change that model? You're not going to do it. You're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart. I mean, you've got to deliver on your financial results.
So, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the last couple of weeks, they've unveiled some new creator tools, and it's amazing how much focus they put on them, even though it's not really going to materially move the needle for many creators. You know, this dynamic sponsorship integration was one of the products that they unveiled, which is, you know, if you did a video and you had a brand partner and it still gets 5,000 views a month, but it's 2 years old, that brand partner, even though the partnership's ended, is still basically getting the value from that. But now they're making it dynamic so you can update it, so you can really sweat your assets. But is it going to make you a millionaire? Probably not.
No, but it is going to lock you in. I mean, it's interesting. Yes. When you look at what many of the things are doing, they're essentially now seemingly trying to chip away at the sort of the role of agents and intermediaries, those who actually advise content creators. Well, that just locks content creators more into YouTube.
Yeah.
You know, it comes back to this point that essentially what you're doing is, you know, in the guise of saying we're helping content creators, what you're really doing is sort of binding them in. And again, you're weighting the negotiating power more to yourself, sort of and away from the creators themselves.
I do wonder if increasingly, because when I've spoken to creators, they do talk about the hamster wheel that they find themselves on. It's creating ever more content. You've got to spend ever more on creating each piece of content. But at some point, surely some of those relatively powerful ones will say, hang on a minute, we're being taken for mugs. And they're going to try and come up with a different, I mean, you know, maybe they'll create their own alternative. Maybe people will go back to owning D2C apps and putting their content on there.
I think the problem with that, well, there's two things. It's a bit of a sort of chicken and egg. In order to get that to work, you almost need to have somebody who breaks ranks first, or a group who breaks ranks first, and people are very careful about not doing so, because if you get it wrong, that's your business model dead.
Yeah.
Particularly in, you know, what's happening with TikTok at the moment, and nobody knows where things are going. There's just no alternative to actually doing that. Again, also as well, I mean, you have the issue of human inertia that comes into this. I mean, again, people tend to, and again, this sort of boils down to, I guess, which really is the sort of maybe an uncomfortable question for all content creators, but how much sort of content that people produce as content creators, how much of it is actually irreplaceable? I think for many audiences, what would happen is if that content disappeared, they'd just find other content to actually watch.
Yeah.
Oh, undoubtedly. But wouldn't that also apply to
absolutely.
TV as well? Kind of, there's a lot of disposable content on TV that people wouldn't miss if it just vanished.
No, I think that's probably true. I mean, you could argue that about, I mean, all forms of media, that essentially if you took it off, we went back 200 years, that people would find other ways to actually entertain themselves and so forth. But I think in the sense of content creators, the whole environment has been set up where it's, where they replace it, the model is being built up, and I think deliberately, where it makes replacement of the content creators very, very easy.
Yeah.
If you think about TV, okay, you get rid of Coronation Street, okay? Sure, people will go and watch something else, but can you come out with something that will replace what people really loved about Coronation Street? For those diehard fans, the answer would probably be no. I think in the case of content creators, that's not the case.
Yeah, and I think in some ways TikTok has accelerated that. So I agree with you that there's a different level. And I think actually, ironically for YouTube is probably better at establishing a relationship with a creator. Something like TikTok, where you're just kind of going through your For You page, kind of TikTok's the thing you end up having the relationship with rather than the actual content.
Oh no, I wouldn't say that, Andy. I mean,
maybe that's just me.
On TikTok, they find I followed somebody on TikTok this morning who I thought I had followed for years because she's constantly in my feed.
And do you follow her on your For You page? And
no,
the algorithm just pops up?
Because every time she comes on, I'm like, there she is again.
Oh, right. Okay.
Come here to me, Ian. Do you have a favorite content creator? Do you even like content creators?
Do I even like content creators? That's a really good question. Do I really like content creators?
Like, have you ever been?
There must be a historian.
There is actually. There is a historian that I find is, look, I mean, I'm sort of, I'm a sort of history geek, and I'm sort of a military history geek as well. So there's a guy called Mark Felton Productions that his stories are quite, some of them are quite interesting. So I'll listen to those from time to time and think, oh, actually, that's a different angle that I haven't even thought about, even given my geekness. But, do I sort of then go off and sort of look for other content creators? I mean, what I tend to find is that, and again, this is just a personal view, is that it's sort of, content creators tend to go to an average. What tends to happen is they tend to follow a certain formula, their presenting style, the way that they set out their content. I mean, this, for example, is why I think Joe Rogan has actually managed to do so well in terms of the podcast field. I mean, essentially what he did was, you could argue, break all the rules. Have a 3-hour podcast where it's just two people talking together for a long time, targeted a lot of young people, where people are like, there's no way this audience is actually going to watch that sort of content. And so what I would argue, and again, this is just my view, and it may show my ignorance more than anything else, is I don't look at the content creation field and think, you know what? There's actually a lot of genuinely original content out there. What I find is that
I think we should send them Haley Morris, Joe. I think we need to send.
We're just gonna spam you with content creators.
Yeah, I know. Now that's it. It's just going to be piled in. I'll get trolled. I'll get the whole
way content creators.
But again, that's.
I mean, I think there's something to that. I mean,
yes, I do.
I think that social media is more dynamic than traditional media in some ways, but just because of the sheer number of people participating, that as soon as a trend is created, it's mimicked by everyone. So the first person that decided to just hold the microphone up to their mouth and kind of record a piece to camera on TikTok like that probably seemed really striking and like they didn't care and it was completely informal. And then everyone copied it. So now everyone has to do it like that. And I think there's that mimicry element to
there is. And that is driven by the algorithm, which again, to your point, Ian, is dictated by the platform itself. But what that does is it forces a lot of it forces a flattening. And maybe that's why TV maybe you're beginning to win me over with this debate, Ian. We need to stop talking. Just because you can create doesn't mean you should. And maybe that's where TV is an advantage, because you need a certain level of prowess. But I mean, I'm going to break my own rule, because yes, Emily, you and I, we exchange creators on TikTok, and I have seen some genuinely innovative, absolutely brilliant creators.
Oh, we should send the one about
a chance on TV.
He'll like the one about the punctuation, Joe. We'll send him the one about the punctuation. You're going to love this. I'm going to send it to you right now.
You're probably right, actually. I probably will. Yeah.
You will. And then this will change your mind. Because I know what you say, like creator economy and creators, and you're like, oh, people who are doing gaming or people who are doing fashion hauls. And I would say that there's so much light and shade in the creator economy for some really, really funny creators and amusing and generally
very smart ones.
And very smart, yeah. And informative, some really informative ones. I'm following this one woman who's basically teaching me how to win arguments. So this is working. So
well, there you go. I mean, it's a funny thing. I mean, like, again, I mean, one is, come back to that point. That's a really important point. What people produce their content for is the algorithm. Not everyone, of course, but overwhelmingly rather than necessarily the content themselves. Their first thing to think, can I get this to appeal to more of a mass market audience? I think there's also as well a human element here as well. It is that, again, and it comes back to this point about TV, when you have a limited amount of space, you're forced to make hard choices. And it's sort of the very nature of going through that process thinks, right, what is it? What is it that will actually, with this limited amount of slots and opportunity, that I can really make a difference? Whereas, of course, if you can, throw content onto a platform and it feels almost unlimited, that quality control, the sort of discipline of it is somewhat eroded. Obviously,
I think it's different, though.
I think it's different.
You need to, like, if you can continue throwing content at the whole, but you need to iterate and you need to watch. And, like, I would honestly say, like, people who produce TV shows up until now, their client is the commissioner, right? Like, that's who they're making the TV show for. They are actually disconnected from the audience and disconnected from the end user, whereas 100%. Creators are completely responsible for the audience that they're driving. And yes, I know, I think it's different. I'm not saying that one is better or one is worse, but I think that, yes, if you have a limited amount of time, you're forced to make creative decisions around, ensuring the absolute clarity of story, et cetera, but when you have to fill consistency in a YouTube channel schedule or a TikTok channel schedule, you're forced to iterate. You're forced to come up with different angles on your idea. Like there is a creative element to that helps, bends your aptitude in a different way.
And the feedback loops that creators get from the data that they get. I mean, within the hour response to a video, they can see the moment that they lose audiences. Yeah. That is something that TV lacks. Yeah.
Then there's definitely a dynamism to the way you can just get content onto YouTube. Which, if YouTube didn't exist or no social media didn't exist, I think that you'd miss the fact that somebody could have an idea today and then have something on YouTube kind of the next day. There's an energy to that.
But you know what? Everything you just talked about there, and we haven't touched upon this subject yet, everything you talked about there sort of sounds like the ideal ground for essentially AI-generated content to replace a lot of content creators.
Yeah.
If you think about what you just said in terms of playing to the algorithm, need for repetition, the need to essentially get content out there and so forth, the most efficient way of doing that, efficient from a industrial process standpoint, is to have AI-generated content that is working 24 hours a day. Sure, there are going to be, I'm so looking forward to hearing about the punctuation one and in action. But, and again, this is just a personal view, a lot of what is out there in terms of content generation, it is average.
Yeah, I don't.
Without doubt. I mean, just to kind of, yeah, well, Well, for me, part of like what I was describing is somebody having an idea that they're really passionate and excited about and being able to make it and get it out there the next day. There's an energy to that immediacy. And that's different from just getting AI to replace that person, because I'm not particularly interested what a robot might come up with. I want a connection to that human being. And I do think that YouTube and those social media platforms, they provide a platform for that.
I think that's the case in certain fields. That's absolutely true. So, for example, I'm actually music and AI. My view is that AI generated music won't replace music for exactly that point. But what people do is they actually focus on the personality. They don't focus on the actual product. But I think when it comes to something like content creation, yes, there are that sort of sliver at the top who you're absolutely right, there is that personal bond with. All those niches that people say, we really love that. You know, we love this content is great. They're putting so much effort into it. They're really driven by the content rather than necessarily trying to build a mass market audience. I would argue for a lot of content creators that actually the differential between what they do and what they produce and what arguably AI could produce, there's not a million miles away from it.
Sure.
So if we're taking this back to World War I, this is when the machines take over the labourers.
Well, look, in effect, I mean, we'll take it back even further. We'll take it back to the Industrial Revolution. You know, I mean, the argument that's always made with AI and the Industrial Revolution is, well, look at the Industrial Revolution. You know, it created so many jobs and new categories of jobs. We can't tell what's happening and so forth. What people miss with that is, one, it took around 40 to 50 years for that to happen. Two, that it actually led to several decades of wage deflation, particularly if you were a skilled artisan sort of on things. Third of all, it essentially, again, weighted a huge amount of power in those who actually sort of own the factories. The sort of, when you look into it and look at the actual details of what went on there, these sort of changes where things are rapidly automated and where the cost of production suddenly collapses, they never benefit the labor producers. They always benefit those who are on the other side of the coin. Very, very rare.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
You know, if you are at the top of your game, but this is the equivalent of a cotton weaver in the early 19th century, being the equivalent of, the most expensive bespoke tailor in Savile Row. Again, there's only a very small sliver that can aspire to that. What happens for the majority is that essentially they see a massive decrease in their bargaining power.
Yeah. Prompt engineering was never a thing, in my opinion. The idea that was going to replace the jobs. Yeah, I completely agree.
Right. Should we take this to the pub or something? Because I feel like
I feel like, to kind of caveating that this is not investment advice, I am going to throw it to you and say, if you were in charge, if you were a broadcaster, how would you urge them to consider their distribution strategy? Whether TV is YouTube and YouTube is TV or not is irrelevant. What's your answer for distribution strategy?
Well, I would argue that actually, if you look at it, you've almost as it were got two sides of the coin here. You've got the linear side, which essentially is, it generally is declining, but it still delivers very good audiences, still has a value, still has brand strength. Yeah, and that is still a very valuable asset. Now, in that situation, you make the most of it as you can. What I would argue in terms of the streaming assets is that opens up a whole range of opportunity because, again, it takes away the sort of the restrictions you've had, the limitations you've had in the amount of content that you could show. And what I would go is, to go back to the point before, I'd take a broadcaster, the core competency is not television. Their core competency is producing audiovisual content on a mass market scale. And what I would say is that opens up to content producers. I would also as well, I'd start to play the rules of the game more effectively. I talked before about the reason why they should get into areas such as children's and music. But particularly you would argue children's because of the potential longer term effect. The way the game is going at the moment is this whole idea that because there's so much information about the advertising markets that decision makers are looking for very simple answers. And so we are moving to a world where essentially it is talking about your advertising share should equal your audience share. Right, you're a broadcaster, maximize that, but maximize it in the cheapest way that you can. Why can't you use children's? Why can't you use your content creators? Why can't you use music videos? Why can't you, even in selected circumstances, use AI-generated content if it works and it gets you, let's say, an extra 5-6 minutes of audience per day?
Yeah.
You know, that's the sort of thing that I would be looking for. I'd be thinking about, you know, there's a great quote that says that essentially people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. And at the moment, sort of what the tech companies I'd argue actually the great sort of thing that the tech companies have done is, and naturally because they're engineers, they've worked out how the process works with advertising, and they very much bent it to their advantage.
Yeah.
And the broadcasters have been left in the dust. But now it's time for the broadcasters to actually realize, you know what? Now we need to play by those same types of rules. And you can do it within a regulatory framework. That's not saying that you have to completely collapse the regulations. But it's been a lot smarter, a lot more nimble, but most of all, actually realizing that the battlefield on which you thought you were fighting, actually, that's not the battlefield, it's somebody else's. And at the moment, it's very much in the favor of the big tech companies.
This kind of chimes with something that we've discussed on here before, in terms of thinking in terms of the method of distribution and the channel. And when you're talking, I'm thinking about the strength of broadcasters is being as producers. Actually, if you think about creating IP and decoupling IP or storytelling from actually the method of delivery and creating it across all of them, if you create something that enough people want to watch, then there's value in that, because it could exist simultaneously on a streamer, linear, 15-second TikToks, lots of content on YouTube. But actually, if you create something that is so white hot that advertisers need to advertise against it, then surely that's the way to monetize better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
I'd only add one thing to that, is that because I think what you described about how the broadcasters should react to that, I completely agree with all of that. I don't think any of it will matter unless they become audience first and become audience experts. And I think sometimes with the traditional media, they've lost sight of what their audience wants. And that's why there's a big space that's opened up for social media, because they've got that direct connection with the audience. And so I think there's an opportunity to become more audience centered, really.
Well, children's content is a prime example of that.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at what the broadcasters did, you know, they looked at them from a very simple sort of, the cost of production, can we advertise them? What they didn't think about were the knock-on effects. And this is why, you know, the online platforms have swooped in so swiftly, because they worked out the end game. Yeah. And they worked out, therefore, you know, in order to, you know, get there, children's content is actually very valuable. It's just not very valuable in the traditional sense. Yes. But it is extremely valuable in the world in which we live now.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Next time, we're definitely recording this in the pub. I think you've hit upon a great point there. Next time, we're all going to the pub and we're taking a microphone.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll be up for that, yeah.
We'll do that.
Amazing.
It might present some challenges in terms of audio recording and who's...
Don't worry, Andy, we're going to be those dicks with the mics that we're holding.
Brilliant. That's a definite. Let's definitely do that. We'll all have to come with a small little furry mics.
Well, thank you. Listen, Ian Whittaker, always brain expanding, never not interesting and fun. So thank you very much for joining us.
And always not investment advice.
Great to be on here. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, Ian.
Take care.
Yeah, that was enormous fun. So thanks very much for you guys for listening as well. And we will see you next week.